Margaret Holloway had always lived a quiet, respectful life. At 60, her days had grown slower, her movements more thoughtful, her eyes carrying the soft weight of decades filled with both love and regret. The house she lived in, though technically owned by her son Aaron, was one she had helped build from scratch with her late husband, Richard. Every corner of it whispered memories: Aaron's first steps in the hallway, birthday cakes in the kitchen, and long Sunday evenings spent laughing on the porch. But ever since Emily had entered the house as Aaron's wife, those comforting echoes had started to fade, replaced by a chilling air of dismissal and indifference. That evening had started like any other. The family had gathered for dinner, and Margaret had quietly made her way to the table, placing a dish of roasted vegetables on the side as Emily brought out the main course. Her presence in the kitchen was slowly becoming unnecessary, a fact Emily reminded her of with passive-aggressive politeness. Dinner was served, and conversation bounced across the table, mostly between Emily and Aaron. Margaret listened with a faint smile, nodding occasionally when someone glanced her way, though it was increasingly rare. They spoke about the latest tech trends, Emily's ambitious project at work, and their plans for renovating the home office. Margaret barely got a word in. She was used to that now. After dinner, she offered to do the dishes, but Emily waved her off with a practiced smile. "It's okay, Margaret. You should go rest. We've got it." It sounded kind on the surface, but Margaret had long learned to hear the subtext. She walked slowly toward her room, but paused when she heard her name mentioned behind her. Their voices were low, muffled by the dining room walls, but still clear enough in the open concept layout. She just kind of hangs around all day, doing nothing, Emily said, exasperated. "I get that she's old, but she doesn't even try to be helpful anymore. It's like having another dependent in the house." Aaron's voice was more hesitant. "She's my mother, Emily. She's not a burden." Emily scoffed. "Aaron, come on. You know what I mean. She's a liability. You can't even talk to her about anything current. Half the time, she's in some daydream about the past. And I'm sorry, but we can't keep shaping our lives around someone who refuses to move forward." Margaret froze. Her hand trembled slightly on the banister as the word liability burned itself into her chest. A lifetime of sacrifice, raising a son with values and patience, supporting him through school, cooking every meal, attending every parent-teacher meeting, had been reduced to that word, liability. As if her existence was now a financial risk, as if the years of building a home, tending to wounds, physical and emotional, were just obsolete acts in a ledger. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears might have come if she hadn't already grown used to the slow erosion of her place in the home. But this was something different. This wasn't a passive exclusion. This was active dismissal, a cold declaration that her presence no longer mattered, worse, that it was an inconvenience. Back in her room, Margaret sat quietly on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her mind swirling not with anger, but clarity. For the first time in years, she saw the outlines of the woman she had been before widowhood, before being just a mother-in-law, before invisibility. She had not always been in the background. Decades ago, Margaret had been a respected consultant for a business accelerator group, with a sharp mind for market strategy and organizational leadership. She had helped at least a dozen mid-level tech companies scale efficiently. She had put her career on hold when Aaron was born, thinking it would be temporary. Then Richard fell ill. Then years passed. Her title faded from LinkedIn. Her phone calls stopped coming, and she, bit by bit, folded herself into the role of quiet homemaker. But now that label liability had cracked something open inside her. It was not just humiliation, it was revelation. It reminded her that people often forget the power behind silence. The next day, Margaret made tea, as usual. She sat in the sunroom, flipping through a tattered notebook she had stored years ago, one filled with notes on business models, investment frameworks, and leadership observations. It had been decades, but the logic still made sense to her. Patterns clicked together like puzzle pieces. She felt the rust in her mind begin to peel away. She remembered that Emily worked at a mid-sized tech firm called Humiliated, specializing in sustainable infrastructure for smart homes. Margaret had overheard her bragging about a pitch she was working on, something that would put her in the spotlight at the company's next board meeting. A promotion was expected. Recognition was guaranteed. Margaret didn't know all the details yet, but she had time and patience. That afternoon, she called Clara Simmons. Clara had been her closest friend during their working years, a woman of wit and steel nerves. Now semi-retired but still managing a few angel investment portfolios. They hadn't spoken in over a year, but the moment Clara picked up and heard Margaret's voice, she said, "Maggie, is that you? What's going on?" Margaret hesitated for only a second before saying, "I need your help, not from me, for a lesson." Clara listened as Margaret explained, not in detail, but with enough precision to spark curiosity. By the end of the call, Clara had already offered her assistance. "You were always the brains, Maggie. You tell me what you need, and we'll make it happen." That night, as Aaron and Emily watched Netflix in the lounge, Margaret sat quietly at her desk, researching. The woman they called a liability was charting corporate acquisitions, investment structures, and non-disclosure partnership entries. Every click reminded her of who she used to be. Every page she turned rebuilt a version of herself, long buried under years of selflessness. Emily walked past her room and saw the light on. She scoffed lightly to herself. "Still up reading romance novels," she muttered as she passed. Margaret looked up and smiled, but not the kind of smile meant to appease. It was the smile of a woman who had just reawakened, the kind that precedes a storm no one sees coming. In the shadows of rejection, Margaret was finding her power again. She wasn't angry, she wasn't bitter, she was focused. And in that quiet resolve, a plan was forming, not one rooted in vengeance, but in truth. Because some lessons can't be taught through lectures. Some realizations come only when the balance of power shifts. Margaret knew she didn't need to raise her voice or win a shouting match. She didn't need to confront Emily in a kitchen or corner her in a family debate. All she needed was to own the boardroom. Margaret woke up early the next morning, earlier than she had in years. The quiet of dawn spilled across the windows like a soft promise, and for the first time in a long while, she felt purpose anchoring her steps. The house was still asleep, Emily and Aaron tucked comfortably in their modern bedroom suite, unaware that the woman they dismissed as a liability was preparing for a return they hadn't imagined. She brewed her tea, the aroma of jasmine reminding her of a time when mornings had been filled with ambition instead of routine. The taste was the same, but everything else had changed. She had changed. The attic hadn't been opened in a long time. Dust danced through the sunbeams as Margaret slowly climbed the creaky wooden steps. Her knees not as strong as they once were, but her will sharper than ever. She reached for the old trunk tucked in the far corner. Behind faded photo albums and boxes labeled with Aaron's childhood years, it had been her personal archive, untouched since the day she had decided that family life required her full attention. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the metal hooks and opened it. Inside lay neatly organized folders, binders with plastic sleeves, flash drives, and printed documents filled with business strategies, graphs, notes, and case studies of work, experience, and insights stored away like relics from another lifetime. She picked up a binder labeled Q4, Strategic Pivots, and flipped through the pages. It was a report she had written 15 years ago for a startup that had eventually sold to a multinational firm. That report had played a key role in their acquisition. She smiled faintly, running her hand over her old signature at the bottom of the final page. The memories flooded back in slow waves. She remembered sitting in Clara's office, tossing ideas back and forth, analyzing weaknesses in operations, tightening revenue models, mentoring interns. Margaret had been good, exceptional, even her ability to anticipate trends, read organizational culture, and design scalable structures had once made her a sought-after voice in business circles. But marriage, then motherhood, and later widowhood had gradually eroded that professional identity. It hadn't been anyone's fault. Richard had fallen ill not long after Aaron started high school. The chemotherapy sessions, hospital stays, and the emotional toll of caregiving consumed her completely. She had quietly packed her ambition into boxes and shifted her attention to what she thought mattered most at the time: family. After Richard passed, she thought about returning, but life had already rewritten her role. And now, in her 60s, she was being told she was a liability. That word echoed in her mind again, but now it was less a wound and more a fuel. She pulled out her old laptop and plugged it in. Miraculously, it powered on. The familiar login screen welcomed her back like an old friend. and within minutes, she was navigating through her archives, passwords still etched into her memory with perfect precision. Margaret spent the next few hours reacquainting herself with the current business landscape. She read white papers, studied startup trends, scanned Forbes profiles, and downloaded reports from financial watchdogs. Her mind, once left idle, was now fully engaged. She wasn't doing this for approval or revenge. She was doing this because it was time. Time to prove, if only to herself, that she had never been obsolete. Later that day, she made a list. At the top was Humiliated, Emily's company. Margaret knew just enough from Emily's bragging to know the firm was undergoing structural changes. Something about new investors, restructuring for international expansion, and key leadership roles being reevaluated. That meant opportunities. Openings. She called Clara again. This time, she spoke with more urgency. Clara listened with the calm intensity only true allies offer. I've already been looking into it, Clara said. Luminat's board has 2 retiring members, and they're offering equity to select investors before they go public. They want a woman-led strategic arm to appeal to ESG investors. Sound like something you'd consider? Margaret paused, then said softly, it sounds like something I never should have given up. Clara chuckled warmly. Then let's dust off the crown. Maggie, you ready? They spent the rest of the day working through legal frameworks, non-disclosure agreements, and private investment briefings. Margaret insisted on discretion. No one, not even Aaron, could know yet. It wasn't about secrecy. It was about preparation. Timing mattered. Later that evening, when Margaret came down for dinner, she found Emily seated at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone and dictating messages to herself. Aaron was in the living room, watching sports. The house felt cold, despite the warm lights. She sat silently across from Emily, who didn't even look up from her screen. Dinner's in the oven, she said casually, as if speaking to a guest. Margaret didn't reply. She just studied her. Emily was sharp, no doubt, ambitious, confident, articulate, but she was also arrogant, dismissive, and blinded by the assumption that age equaled irrelevance. That was her weakness. Margaret knew that well-known Emily's inability to see value beyond the new, the trending, the immediately visible. Margaret herself had once been like that, in her 20s, intoxicated by her own intelligence. As the oven timer rang, Emily rose, dished out food for herself and Aaron, and left the rest. Margaret served herself quietly, taking her meal to the sunroom. The garden outside was dark, stars twinkling faintly behind a gauze of summer clouds. She sat there, savoring the moment, not of solitude, but of unfolding strategy. She began journaling against something she hadn't done in years. Not just feelings, but goals, observations, moves she needed to make. Clara had already set up a shell company through which the shares would be acquired. Margaret was to be listed as a silent partner until the deal closed. In a few weeks, she would hold controlling interest in Humiliated. Not just ownership, but authority. And Emily wouldn't even know until it was too late. The days that followed were filled with dual lives. In the mornings, Margaret was the soft-spoken older woman, tending to houseplants and folding laundry. By afternoon, she was in Zoom calls with financial analysts and legal teams, reviewing company culture reports and employee feedback data. Her strategy was meticulous. She didn't just want to own Humiliated, she wanted to transform it. She also began mentoring a few young women. Clara had connected her with graduates looking to break into corporate consulting. They met virtually once a week. Margaret rediscovered her gift for listening deeply and offering guidance without dominating the conversation. It felt good to see her words land again, to be respected, to be relevant. She wasn't just rebuilding herself, she was passing the torch to One afternoon, as she came out of her room, she passed Emily on the stairs. Emily, surprised, asked, "You've been busy lately. Something going on?" Margaret smiled. "Just revisiting old hobbies." Emily laughed lightly. "Well, whatever keeps you entertained." Margaret nodded politely, then walked away. She didn't need validation anymore. What she was building was not for show, was for legacy, and that kind of power didn't need permission. Back in her room, she pulled up an internal document. Clara had shared a list of potential department heads. Humiliated would be restructuring in the next quarter. One of the names stood out. Emily Holloway, scheduled for promotion to Vice President of Corporate Strategy, pending final review by the incoming chairwoman, asterisk. Margaret leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The irony wasn't lost on her. Life had a way of looping in circles, delivering poetic symmetry when you least expected it. Her daughter-in-law, who had mocked her as a relic of the past, would soon be presenting strategy plans to the very woman she dismissed. Asterisk, but Margaret wasn't angry. She wasn't plotting revenge. She was simply reclaiming what was always hers. Her dignity, her brilliance, and her seat at the table. Asterisk, she would wait. Patiently, she would let Emily have her spotlight for now, because, soon enough, the lights would shift, and Margaret would be there, not to humiliate, not to shout, but to remind the world, and one ungrateful daughter-in-law, that a woman's worth is not determined by her age, but by her resilience. And Margaret Holloway had only just begun. The morning began with the soft clinking of china. Margaret set 2 cups on the kitchen counter, pouring tea into both with the grace of habit. Though she knew only one would be drunk, the other cup sat untouched, like her place in the familia, silent offering, unacknowledged. The house was still cloaked in the drowsy hush of early morning. Sunlight filtered in through the sheer curtains, gilding the counters in pale gold. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, there was a chill, one not from the weather, but from the strained energy that had wrapped itself around every room like an invisible thread, pulling at her edges. Asterisk, she carried her cup into the sunroom, sat in her usual wicker chair, and looked out at the garden she had once tended with such joy. Now, weeds crept along the stone borders, a quiet rebellion against neglect. It mirrored her heart full of things once beautiful, now ignored. Yet something had shifted in her recently. Not just the clarity she had discovered after overhearing Emily's hurtful words, but a steadiness that seemed to root itself deeper every day. She was no longer uncertain. The past had stopped being a weight. It was now her compass. Asterisk, later that morning, Margaret heard Emily talking loudly on the phone. The voice echoed from the hallway, energetic and dismissive. Asterisk, no, she doesn't do much around here. I mean, she's sweet and all, but mostly just ... there. Like decoration. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a retirement home. It's exhausting. Asterisk, Margaret didn't flinch this time. The sting of words had dulled, replaced by resolve. She quietly rose from her chair, placed her cup in the sink, and walked back to her room. Asterisk, she sat down and opened her laptop, where Clara had left her a new message. Margaret, we're nearly there. The equity sale will be finalized by next week. All documents are in motion. Your name will be disclosed to the board in 2 weeks, as agreed. You ready for this? Asterisk, she typed back. More than ready. Thank you, Clara. I'll handle the rest when the time comes. Asterisk, for the next hour, Margaret reviewed Luminat's employee performance data. Emily had always boasted about her accomplishments, about being the youngest strategist in the division, about how her projections had saved the company thousands. Margaret now read the data with professional scrutiny. The numbers weren't bad, but they weren't exceptional. Emily was talented, yes, but she lacked the humility and foresight to lead long-term. Her strategies focused on short-term gains, presentations, and aggressive KPIs, but lacked the vision necessary for sustainable growth. That weakness, masked by charm and confidence, was dangerous for a company in transition. Asterisk, Margaret made notes, highlighting key departments that lacked collaboration metrics and employee retention rates that had dipped over the last 2 quarters. She saw where investments were being misused, where innovation was being choked by rigid leadership structures. It was clear that Luminatech needed more than surface-level change. It needed rethinking from the inside out. Asterisk, by noon, she had drafted her first proposal, a restructuring plan, balanced, measured, forward-thinking. She saved it under the title, New Roots. Asterisk, meanwhile, in the dining room, Emily hosted 2 of her colleagues for lunch, fellow strategists from Luminatech. Margaret recognized one of them as Mona, a confident woman with a polished air and sharp eyes. They laughed loudly over salad and sparkling water, their conversation rich with gossip. Asterisk, apparently, there's a new investor buying in, Mona said, leaning in. Rumor is, she's old money, a woman. Not sure if she's got any experience, or if it's just a vanity stake. Asterisk, Emily smirked. Well, if she's old, she'll better stay out of my way. I've worked too hard to let some clueless dinosaur interfere with my promotion. Asterisk, the other colleague chuckled. Just flash that smile, Em. You've got the board wrapped around your finger. Asterisk Margaret, who had paused in the hallway on her way to the kitchen, stood very still. She felt no anger, only an affirmation. The company culture, especially in leadership, had become toxic. That confirmed her intention. This acquisition wouldn't just be business. It would be justice, not just for her, but for every overlooked, underestimated woman whose wisdom had been shelved in favor of superficial brilliance. Asterisk later that evening, Aaron approached her. His tone was hesitant, awkward, the way people speak when guilt has started to bloom in the back of their minds. Asterisk Mom, Emily said, you've been on your laptop a lot lately. Everything okay? Asterisk Margaret smiled gently. Yes, everything's fine, just picking up old interests. Asterisk Aaron nodded slowly. She's just worried you're maybe overworking yourself. You know, at your age, asterisk my age, she interrupted softly, has nothing to do with my capacity. Aaron, asterisk he looked embarrassed. I didn't mean it like that. Asterisk I know, but I want you to remember something. I may be older, but I'm not absent. I see things. I hear things, and I'm learning that sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness. Asterisk Aaron shifted uncomfortably. We don't think you're weak. I mean ... We appreciate you. Asterisk Margaret nodded, letting the pause stretch. Appreciation means more when it's not just in words, but in actions. Asterisk he looked as though he wanted to say more, but thought better of it. Anyway, let me know if you need anything. Asterisk I will. Asterisk that night, after they had all gone to bed, Margaret walked into the kitchen, warmed up a cup of tea, and sat under the pale pendant light above the counter. The house was quiet. It was the kind of silence she now welcomed, not the silence of being ignored, but the quiet before a turning tide. Asterisk she thought of Richard then, her late husband, and how proud he'd been of her when she'd first been published in a major business journal. He used to say, you have the mind of a queen, Margaret. Never let anyone make you feel like a pawn. She had forgotten that for a while, but not anymore. Asterisk she opened her journal and began writing again, not business plans this time, but thoughts, hopes, a reminder to herself that reinvention wasn't a privilege of the young, it was a birthright of the determined. Asterisk she wrote, they serve me cold tea and warmer lies, but I no longer drink what's offered. I'm brewing something of my own, and it will change everything. Asterisk the next morning, Margaret was different. She no longer moved quietly to avoid attention. She walked through the house with calm purpose. Emily watched her with thinly veiled suspicion. There was something in Margaret's posture now that unsettled her, a self-assurance Emily hadn't seen before. Asterisk, are you going somewhere? Emily asked casually, as Margaret emerged wearing a crisp navy blouse and polished shoes. Asterisk, just a meeting, Margaret replied. Asterisk meeting. With who? Asterisk Margaret turned, her expression kind but unreadable. An old friend. We're working on a project. Asterisk Emily narrowed her eyes. You didn't say anything before. Asterisk I didn't think it was necessary. Asterisk before Emily could press further, Margaret was out the door. She met Clara at a cafe downtown, where they finalized the final stage of the transition. The next board meeting was in 10 days. Margaret would be introduced as the new chairwoman. Her identity as the acquiring investor would be unveiled. Clara smiled as they signed the final agreements. Asterisk still sure you want to do this yourself? Clara asked. I can speak for you in the meeting. Asterisk Margaret shook her head. No, this is mine. I need her to see me walk in, not as her mother-in-law, not as an old woman, but as the woman who now owns the table. She thought she dominated. They clinked coffee cups in a silent toast. That night, Margaret returned home to find Emily already asleep. The house was dim, the moonlight spilling over the hardwood floors like a soft veil. Margaret sat by the window and stared out into the darkness, knowing the storm was coming, not of destruction, but of revelation. She wasn't just reclaiming her dignity, she was reclaiming her story. And for the first time in years, she couldn't wait for tomorrow. Margaret stood at the mirror that morning longer than usual. She observed her reflection not with vanity, but with the critical eye of a strategist preparing for the field. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a smooth bun, her navy blazer pressed perfectly, and a brooch Richard had once gifted her glimmered just under her collar. It wasn't about appearance, it was about presence. She needed to look like she belonged in the boardroom again, because soon, she wouldn't just belong, she would lead. The house was unusually quiet, as if sensing something pivotal was unfolding. Emily had left early for a strategic alignment meeting, babbling about last-minute changes to her presentation for Luminatic's upcoming internal review. She had mentioned casually at dinner the night before. There's a big shake-up happening, rumors of new ownership, but nothing concrete yet. Whatever happens, I'm confident I'll come out on top. Her voice had that usual arrogance, unaware of how close the truth was hovering. Margaret, meanwhile, had a different destination that day. She wasn't heading to a coffee shop or a boutique like Emily Mitov assumed. She was on her way to the offices of Luminatic's Legal and Investment Committee. The day had arrived, the final day of the acquisition. After months of silent maneuvering, late-night calls with Clara, and sleepless nights running through numbers and reports, she was ready to sign the dotted line that would make her the majority stakeholder of the company her daughter-in-law worshipped like a second religion. Clara met her at the elevator on the 23rd floor. You look ready to take the world by its collar, she said with a grin, holding a leather folder thick with papers. Margaret gave a faint smile. Let's give them something to remember. Inside the conference room sat a mix of lawyers, shareholders, and 2 departing board members, one of whom she vaguely remembered from a conference years ago. They greeted her politely, if somewhat dismissively at first. But the moment Clara introduced her formally as the acquiring partner, and the room understood that Margaret Holloway wasn't just a symbolic face, but the woman injecting real capital and strategic oversight, they paid attention. The final documents were reviewed, clauses dissected, and Margaret asked intelligent questions that even Clara hadn't anticipated. When the papers were signed, the room applauded lightly. It was done. Margaret Holloway now owned 52% of Luminatic. She wasn't just part of the board, she controlled it. Walking out of the building. The city looked different, sharper, more alive. Not because it had changed, but because she had done something most people her age were never allowed to dream of. Again she had re-entered the world not as a relic, but as a force. And nobody, not her son, not her dismissive daughter, Neela, could take that away now. Back home, Margaret was greeted with the smell of burnt toast. Emily was in the kitchen, muttering to herself while trying to scrape blackened slices of bread into the trash. Ugh, toaster's acting up again, she mumbled. Margaret took a seat at the breakfast bar. Calm and composed. Emily looked up and narrowed her eyes. You're dressed up again. Another meeting? Margaret nodded. Yes, something important. Emily raised a brow. You've been vague about that lately. Margaret sipped her tea. Sometimes the important things in life don't need to be explained to those who won't understand them. Emily blinked, clearly unsure if she'd been insulted. Well, I hope it's something productive. Oh, it was, Margaret said softly. Very productive. Later that day, Emily left for Luminatic excited about her upcoming presentation. She'd spent the entire week preparing a strategic proposal for their new smart grid expansions, something she believed would solidify her promotion. She had even practiced her speech in front of the mirror, fine-tuning every sentence to perfection. In her eyes, this was her moment, the one that would catapult her into the executive level. What she didn't know was that the moment she was rehearsing for it had already been decided by someone she had spent months dismissing. Back at Luminatic, the staff buzzed with nervous energy. Whispers of new ownership had grown louder, and the announcement of a formal board meeting to reveal the new chairwoman had sent a ripple through every department. Emily, as always, wore her confidence like armor. She walked into the office with her head high, smiling to those who seemed unsure. I'm hearing the new owner is a woman, Mona said as they passed each other in the hallway. Some think it's one of the partners from Northern Ridge Ventures. Emily scoffed. Whoever she is, she better appreciate innovation and results. That's what I bring. No outdated fluff. She stepped into the conference room for the prep meeting, expecting the same familiar faces. But something was different. There was a new seat at the head of the table, one that had always been left vacant unless the founding member made an appearance. And seated there, calmly adjusting the microphone, was Margaret Holloway. Emily froze in the doorway. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The blood drained from her face as she tried to process the image before her. Margaret looked up. Her expression was serene, almost motherly, but her eyes held the fire of someone who had come to reclaim her narrative. Good afternoon, everyone, she said. Before we begin, Allow me to introduce myself. I am Margaret Holloway, and as of this morning, I am your new majority stakeholder and chairwoman. Asterisk, there was silence, followed by a smattering of astonished murmurs. Emily stood rooted to the spot, her face pale, her carefully planned day unraveling in real time. Asterisk, Margaret gestured to a seat. Emily, do join us. I understand you have a presentation prepared. Asterisk, still in shock. Emily sat, her voice trembled as she began. I wasn't aware you had a background in corporate strategy. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. I didn't think you were aware of much about me at all. Asterisk, Emily tried to recover, moving into her slides. Her voice was shaky at first, but regained some of its practiced rhythm. She discussed projections, market gaps, and Luminotech's growth potential. Her arguments were well structured, her visuals sharp. Asterisk, but Margaret listened intently, taking notes. When the presentation ended, she thanked her calmly and opened the floor. Asterisk, I appreciate your work, Emily. I do. Your enthusiasm is admirable. But I believe in leadership that is collaborative, not just competitive. Innovation is important, but so is humility. So is vision that sees beyond quarterly metrics. Asterisk, Emily opened her mouth to argue, but Margaret raised a hand gently. Asterisk, you'll still be a part of the team, but your role will be adjusted. Effective next quarter, you'll be reassigned under the R&D Collaborative Department, reporting to the new Vice President of Innovation. We need your creativity, but under mentorship and guidance. Asterisk, Emily was stunned. You're demoting me. Asterisk, I'm aligning your strengths with where they can grow best. Margaret replied. Asterisk, the meeting concluded with formal introductions, handshakes, and silent awe from the board members. Margaret had not just arrived, she had taken command. Asterisk, Emily stormed out of the building afterward, her mind spinning, her ego bruised, her assumptions shattered. She had underestimated the woman who had raised the man she married, and now that woman owned her professional world. Asterisk, back home. Aaron noticed the tension instantly when Emily returned. Asterisk, what happened? He asked. Asterisk, Emily shook her head, almost laughing bitterly. You're not going to believe this. Your mother bought my company. She's the new chairwoman. She just sat there like some kind of queen and restructured everything. Asterisk, Aaron looked stunned. Wait, what, Mom? Asterisk, Emily paced. I called her a liability. I said she was just furniture in this house. And all this time she was orchestrating a takeover. Asterisk, Aaron sat down slowly, the weight of realization hitting him. He thought about all the times he'd ignored her voice, overlooked her ideas, treated her like a shadow in his own home. Asterisk, I had no idea she was capable of that, he whispered. Asterisk, she's been capable of far more than any of us realize, Emily said, collapsing into a chair. And now, she's in charge. Asterisk, Margaret, alone in her room, removed her blazer and hung it carefully. She looked out the window and saw her reflection faintly in the glass. Not a liability, not invisible, but a leader. A woman who had never lost her power, only her place. Asterisk, and now she had reclaimed it, quietly, powerfully, completely. Asterisk, the air in the Holloway home was noticeably different the following morning. Margaret moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove anymore. No more was she the silent presence at breakfast, the overlooked figure by the window, or the background character in her own life. She had shifted the axis of her world without shouting, without conflictingly, with clarity and power, and it radiated off her now in the smallest of ways. The way she straightened a crooked frame on the hallway wall, the way she held her tea with a steady hand while reading the morning news, even the way she smiled at Emily.com and unreadable, suggested that everything had changed. Asterisk, Emily, on the other hand, was unraveling. The night before had been a storm inside her. Rage, embarrassment, confusion, but most of all, disbelief. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, Margaret's calm voice announcing her position as chairwoman, the eyes of the board members shifting toward her, the taste of humiliation when her promotion turned into a professional redirection. She had barely spoken a word on the drive home, and Aaron, still stunned by the revelation, had simply tried to stay out of the crossfire. Asterisk, now. At the breakfast table, Emily poked half-heartedly at her toast while Aaron scrolled through his phone. Margaret joined them with her usual grace, wearing a soft cream cardigan and a look of quiet satisfaction. She sipped her tea and glanced at Emily. Asterisk, rough day yesterday? She asked, her tone neutral. Asterisk, Emily stiffened. You blindsided me. Asterisk, I gave a presentation. You did the same. One was strategic. One was theatrical. Asterisk, Aaron lowered his phone, alarmed. Can we not do this right now? Asterisk, I'm not trying to cause a scene. Margaret replied, folding her napkin. I just think we should stop pretending that yesterday didn't happen. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in clarity. Asterisk, Emily's voice was sharp now. Clarity. You humiliated me in front of the entire board. Asterisk, I didn't humiliate you, Margaret said firmly. Your ego did. I gave you space to present your ideas. I listened, and then I made a decision based on what was best for the company. That's what leaders do. Asterisk, Aaron looked between them, unsure where to interject. He had always known his mother was intelligent, capable, but he had never imagined the extent of her influence. Now that influence was undeniable. She had risen from the background and taken the wheel with precision. Asterisk, Margaret stood, her posture as straight as her words. I'm not your adversary, Emily, but I won't be your doormat either. You made your assumptions. I simply corrected them. Asterisk, with that, she walked out, leaving a stunned silence behind her. Emily's face was flushed with emotion, but no words came out. Aaron watched her carefully, unsure whether to console her or commend his mother. Asterisk, later that day, Margaret returned to Luminatech's headquarters. This time, it was not for a quiet meeting or a behind-the-scenes signature. Today was about her vision. She had summoned the department heads, including Emily's new manager, to discuss the new era of leadership. She wore no arrogance, no certainty. She had earned her place, and now she intended to use it to lead. Asterisk, the meeting room buzzed with nervous energy. Some of the executives weren't sure what to expect. They knew Margaret Holloway only by name or title, but when she entered the room, they were immediately struck by her poise. She didn't need to demand respect. She carried it with her. Asterisk, she began the meeting with a story, not one of acquisition or power, but of resilience. She spoke about stepping away from her career for family, about watching companies she helped build grow without her, and about rediscovering her voice after years of silence. Her words weren't just inspiring, they were deeply human. Asterisk, I've been underestimated, she said, locking eyes with each person. I've been overlooked, and in that invisibility, I learned to see everything others missed. The room was silent, every person riveted. We're going to restructure, not just for profit, but for purpose, she continued. We will innovate sustainably, build inclusively, and lead with long-term integrity that starts with accountability and ends with legacy. And every one of you is going to be part of that story if you choose to be. Asterisk, by the time the meeting ended, even the most skeptical managers nodded in agreement. Margaret had not come to reign, she had come to transform. Asterisk, meanwhile, back at home, Emily tried to regain her balance. She sent emails, scheduled meetings, and tried to reassure her team that everything was under control. But the truth haunted her. Margaret hadn't needed a spotlight to make her move. She had been working in the shadows, building an empire while Emily had been dismissing her as irrelevant. Asterisk, she remembered the day she first moved into the Holloway home. How Margaret had graciously offered her the master bedroom while taking the smaller guest room for herself. At the time, Emily had viewed it as a submission, a sign of weakness, but now she understood it differently. Margaret had not given up space, she had simply allowed others to think they had won. And while they celebrated imagined victories, she had been patiently setting the board for her next move. Asterisk, that evening, Emily sat in the living room with Aaron. Unusually quiet, the tension was thick, but not hostile, just heavy with unspoken truths. Asterisk, I didn't know she was that powerful, Emily said softly. Asterisk, Aaron nodded. Neither did I, but maybe we never gave her the chance to show us. Asterisk, Emily looked down. I called her a liability. To you, to my colleagues, even to her face. Sometimes, I didn't even see her as a person with a past, with accomplishments. Asterisk, she was always more than we saw, Aaron said, rubbing his temples. I think we got used to her being quiet and assumed that meant she had nothing to say. Asterisk, Emily sighed. Well, she had plenty to say, and now the entire company's listening. Asterisk, across the house, Margaret sat at her desk reviewing new team proposals. One application caught her eye, a young woman from a rural college who had built a community energy grid project on minimal funding. Margaret immediately saw her potential and requested to meet her for mentorship. She remembered how hard it was to be taken seriously when no one knew your name. Asterisk, her door creaked open, and Aaron stepped in. He looked uncertain, a little older than he had the day before, as though the weight of realization had matured him overnight. Asterisk, can I sit? He asked. Asterisk, Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. Of course. Asterisk, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. She paused her work, giving him her full attention. I let Emily treat you like you didn't matter. I didn't stand up for you. I didn't ask about your past or what you wanted out of life. I assumed you'd just be happy sitting on the sidelines. Asterisk, Margaret gave him a gentle smile. You assumed I was done, but I wasn't. I was just quiet. Asterisk, Aaron swallowed hard. You're incredible, Mom. I wish I'd said that before you had to prove it this way. Asterisk, I didn't do it to prove anything, she said. I did it because I still had more to give. I'm not trying to take your place or hers. I'm just reclaiming mine. Asterisk, he nodded. I hope Emily learns from this. Asterisk, she will, Margaret said. Pain is a good teacher, but grace is a better one. If she can learn both, she'll be stronger. Asterisk, they sat in silence for a few moments, not needing to fill the space. Something between them had healed, quietly, without dramatics, just as Margaret preferred. Asterisk, later. As the house settled into evening routines, Emily knocked on Margaret's door. She held a small tray with 2 cups of tea. Asterisk, I thought you might like jasmine, she said quietly. Asterisk, Margaret looked at the tray, then at Emily. Thank you. Asterisk, Emily sat down. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I wanted to start somewhere. Asterisk, Margaret took a sip of the tea and nodded. That's how every journey starts. One step. Asterisk, Emily hesitated, then said, You're not a liability. You're the strongest woman I've ever met. Asterisk, Margaret's eyes softened. Sometimes, people don't see your worth until you stop explaining it and start living it. Asterisk, and so, with warm tea between them, and the weight of months of tension beginning to lift, they sat in shared silence, not as enemies, not even as family, but as two women, learning, finally, to respect each other. Margaret had bought a company, but more importantly, she had rebuilt her identity, and the world, once blind to her value, had no choice now but to see her clearly. Asterisk, the sun rose slowly that morning, casting golden slants of light across Margaret's desk as she reviewed the latest performance reports from Luminatic, her office at home, once a forgotten corner stacked with sewing kits and boxes of old family photographs, had transformed into a hub of leadership. Sleek but warm, its shelves were now filled with reports, binders, and strategy books with post-it notes peeking out like colored flags. On the windowsill sat a single potted lavender plant, come steady, much like the woman who sat beside it. Asterisk, Margaret Holloway had not just taken control of a company, she had redefined herself, and each day since the boardroom revelation had been a careful step into that new identity, not one forced upon her by family or age, but one she chose deliberately. However, what came with power wasn't just clarity and control, it was scrutiny. Asterisk, it had been 4 days since Emily's reassignment, and though Margaret had kept things professional at work, she could sense a shift. Not just in Emily's attitude, but in the reactions of others. Some employees viewed Margaret as a visionary leader. Others saw her as a threatened, unexpected matriarch who had disrupted the corporate hierarchy with one bold move. She understood their doubts. In a world obsessed with youth and flash, a 60-year-old woman quietly rising to power felt like a paradox. Asterisk, but Margaret didn't flinch. She showed up at every meeting prepared. She offered strategy rooted in experience, not just theory. Her insights stunned department heads who expected shallow ideas and instead received depth, wisdom, and a sense of long-term vision that had been missing for years. Asterisk, that morning, as she scanned the team development report, she saw something curious. Emily had submitted her first revised project brief under the R&D division. The structure was solid, clean, organized, even humble. Margaret read through it twice. There were no flashy metaphors, no aggressive projections. Instead, it was cautious, but thoughtful, with room for collaboration. Asterisk, she leaned back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the paper. It was clear Emily had been shaken, but not broken. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to learn. Asterisk, later, at headquarters, Margaret sat in on a presentation given by a junior developer named Leah. The young woman was nervous, stumbling through her pitch on AI-integrated energy systems. The room was full of impatient managers, already checking their phones. Margaret saw it, the flicker of self-doubt in Leah's eyes, the urge to shrink. She leaned forward. Leah, she said, gently, interrupting the slide. Tell me what excites you most about this idea, not in data, but in your own words. Leah hesitated, then slowly began to speak from the heart, about energy justice, about her father's small farm losing power due to outdated grids, about building tech that could make rural life sustainable. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. When she finished, the room was silent. Margaret smiled. That's what we build here. Not just numbers. Meaning. After the meeting, Leah approached her with tears in her eyes. Thank you. I thought I was going to be laughed out of the room. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. You reminded me of myself. Never stop speaking like that. People eventually learn to listen. On the drive home, Margaret thought about that moment. Her success wasn't just about ownership, it was about creating space for voices like Leah's, for women like herself, for anyone who had ever been told they were too quiet, too old, too emotional, too much, or too little. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw Aaron outside trimming the hedge, a rare sight. He looked up and gave her a sheepish wave. She stepped out of the car, surprised. Garden therapy? She asked with a small smile. Trying to make up for all the times you did it alone, he replied. Margaret appreciated the gesture. Aaron had been different lately, more present, thoughtful. It was as if his mother's transformation had forced him to reassess his own place in the world. They stood in silence for a moment, the rustle of leaves their only soundtrack. Emily's trying, Aaron said finally. She's been quieter at home. And at work. I think she's rethinking everything. She's smart, Margaret said, but her pride was always louder than her perception. Maybe that's changing. Aaron nodded. She's never respected anyone the way she's starting to respect you. Margaret gave a faint smile. Respect earned under pressure tends to last. Inside the house. Emily was sitting at the dining table with her laptop. When Margaret walked in, Emily stood up instinctively. She no longer looked at Margaret with irritation or defensiveness. There was something new in her eyes, reluctant admiration, perhaps even remorse. I got your notes on my brief, she said. Thank you for not tearing it apart. I don't tear down potential, Margaret replied. I build on it. Emily looked down. I didn't used to believe in second chances, but I'm beginning to understand them now. Margaret set her bag on the chair and took a deep breath. This was the conversation she hadn't planned for, but maybe it was time. You know, she began, when I first entered your world, the one of digital strategies and data models, I was afraid. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wasn't sure I was allowed back into it. Emily looked confused. Allowed? I stepped out for years. Motherhood, grief, loneliness, then came judgment. From others, from myself. I was afraid that the world had moved on without me and that all I had left was to fade quietly in the background. Emily said nothing, only listening. But then you called me a liability, and something snapped. Not in anger, in memory. I remembered who I had been, what I had given, what I still had to give. Emily's voice broke slightly. I didn't mean it, or maybe I did. I don't know. I was insecure. I thought I had to dominate to prove myself. And I saw you as passive in the way. Margaret nodded. We see others as obstacles when we haven't dealt with our own fears. Emily wiped a tear from her eye. You didn't just outmaneuver me, Margaret. You taught me, without even trying. Margaret reached over, gently touching her hand. This house doesn't need a queen. It needs peace. And maybe, if we stop competing for control, we can start sharing wisdom. Emily chuckled softly, wiping another tear. You're dangerous with kindness. I've had decades to practice it. That night, something shifted between them. It wasn't reconciliation in the grand, dramatic sense. It was subtler, an unspoken agreement that things would be different now. That the war of egos had ended. Margaret had won not because she crushed Emily's spirit, but because she awakened it. Before going to bed. Margaret walked past the kitchen and noticed a single sheet of paper pinned to the fridge. It was a note in Emily's handwriting. To the woman I once dismissed, thank you for reminding me that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it simply waits to be seen. Margaret smiled, folded the note gently, and placed it in her journal. Later, in her room, she sat by her window, the lavender plant gently swaying in the night air. She opened her laptop one last time that day to draft a new memo to the Borden Initiative for Mentoring Programs that paired senior executives with junior innovators, a bridge between generations, experiences, and voices. It was the kind of future she wished someone had built for her. But now, she was building it for others. The lights dimmed. The room grew quiet. And Margaret Holloway, once underestimated, now admired, closed her eyes with peace, knowing that her journey wasn't about revenge, that it was about rebirth. Margaret stepped out into the morning light, her steps steady as the gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes. The day had arrived for Luminatics' first official executive roundtable under her leadership. Unlike the formal board meetings, this event wasn't about decisions. It was about dialogue. It was her idea, born from a conviction that real change didn't come from top-down orders, but from horizontal conversations. Leaders didn't just dictate, they listened, especially when they were rebuilding trust in a company whose culture had quietly rotted under unchecked ambition. As she entered the building, employees greeted her with subtle nods and occasional surprised smiles. Her presence had become expected now, but not yet routine. People still whispered about the woman who had risen from obscurity to ownership, about how she had corrected the balance of power, not with a public fight, but with private precision. In the conference room, the setting was more relaxed than usual. No imposing podium, no strict seating chart, just a round table, open laptops, paper notebooks, and coffee. Department heads from across Luminatics settled in, unsure what to expect but curious enough to lean forward instead of back. Margaret began not with a speech, but with a question. What's the one thing, she asked, you wish the person above you truly understood about your work? There was hesitation at first. Eyes darted, fingers tapped, pens, and then Mona, usually outspoken but guarded since the ownership change, took the bait. That ideas take time, she said. We're expected to innovate, pitch, polish, and execute within 2-week sprints. But not everything creative thrives on a clock. Another chimed in. That risk aversion is killing us. We reject bold proposals before they leave paper because we're scared of quarterly backlash. The room slowly warmed with honesty. Margaret listened without interrupting, her pen moving gently across a leather-bound notebook. Every word mattered to her not just as data points, but as stories, truths. When the meeting paused for coffee, Emily approached her, carrying 2 cups. Peace offering, she said, handing her one. Margaret accepted it with a faint smile. Thanks, Emily Lingard. You were right, we stopped listening to each other. Somewhere along the way, we started managing people like assets instead of humans. Margaret met her gaze. You can't innovate if your people are afraid they'll give you numbers, but they won't give you themselves. Emily nodded, her voice quieter. I used to think control was power. And now, I think listening is. Margaret's smile deepened. Then you're growing. The round table resumed, now energized with candor. Proposals flew, some modest, some radical. Margaret encouraged them all. Her leadership didn't punish failure. It punished apathy. That was her standard now. Try, think, feel, share, be human. After the session, she invited a few team leads to walk with her in the rooftop garden, recently refurbished under her supervision. The space, once an unused slab of concrete, was now a modest green refuge, low benches, herb planters, and a few flowering bushes. As they stood among the soft fragrance of rosemary and lavender. She told them a story from her consulting days, how one of the first companies she had helped went bankrupt not because their product was flawed, but because their leadership refused to admit when they needed help. Their pride cost them millions, she said. It always starts small, a missed email, a withheld opinion, a culture of silence. The younger team leads took mental notes. They could see why Margaret was different. She didn't just manage the business, she breathed it. Her success wasn't in spite of her age. It was because of it. Back at home, Aaron was preparing dinner, an unusual sight that made Margaret pause at the doorway. He was wearing an apron and squinting at a recipe on his phone. Lasagna night, she asked. He turned, startled. Oh yeah, thought I'd give it a shot. Asterisk, she chuckled. Just don't burn the bottom. Asterisk, no promises. Asterisk, they laughed a sound they hadn't shared in a long time. Aaron was rediscovering his mother not as the caretaker who folded his shirts or paid for his school books, but as the woman who built systems, led teams, and had now acquired a company without so much as raising her voice. Asterisk, over dinner, conversation flowed with unusual ease. Emily was quieter, more reflective, but present. She asked Margaret questions, not forced ones, but genuine ones, about her time in consulting, about the companies she'd helped build, about the decisions that had shaped her. Asterisk, at one point, Aaron said, I can't believe you've been carrying all this knowledge around, and we just didn't ask. Asterisk, Margaret smiled but didn't gloat. Sometimes, people don't ask the right questions until they're ready to hear the answers. Asterisk, Emily set her fork down. You've changed everything. At home, at work, even in me. Asterisk, I didn't change you, Margaret replied. I just held up a mirror. Asterisk, later that evening, Margaret returned to her room, where a small stack of letters awaited her. Real paper letters, mailed from Luminatech employees who felt more comfortable expressing themselves that way than via email. She opened one from a young coder named Rena. Asterisk, thank you for making it okay to speak up. I've always felt invisible in tech spaces. Now, I feel seen. You made that possible. Asterisk, another was from an older manager on the brink of retirement, who wrote, Asterisk, you reminded me that age doesn't mean I had planned to retire this year. Now I want to stay and mentor. Thank you. Asterisk, Margaret folded the letters carefully and placed them inside a box on her shelf labeled Y. I returned. The box was nearly full. Asterisk, the next morning, she visited her old friend Clara. They sat on Clara's porch, sipping orange blossom tea and watching the world wake up. Asterisk, you look different, Clara said. Asterisk, I feel different, Margaret replied. I'm finally myself again. Asterisk, was it worth it? Clara asked. Asterisk, Margaret didn't hesitate. Every second. Asterisk, you didn't just buy a company, Clara said. You bought your freedom. Asterisk, Margaret nodded slowly. And now I'm using it to create space for others. Asterisk, Clara looked at her with admiration. You know they'll write articles about this someday. Woman over 60 reshapes corporate culture. Rewrites rules. Asterisks, they can write what they want, Margaret said. I didn't do it for headlines. I did it for the women, like me, silenced, sidelined, underestimated. If I lit a path, that's enough. Asterisk, they sat in silence a while longer. Two women who had weathered decades, careers, losses, and reinventions. Then Clara reached over and raised her teacup. Asterisk, to the queen of quiet power. She said. Asterisk, Margaret clinked her cup against Clara's. To never asking for a seat, just bringing your own table. Asterisk, that evening, as she walked through the halls of her home, Margaret passed the mirror near the entryway, the same one where, weeks ago, she had barely recognized the woman looking back. Now, the woman in the glass met her eyes without hesitation. Steady, certain, alive. Asterisk, not a burden, not a relic, not a liability. Asterisk, but a builder, a teacher, a force. Asterisk, Margaret Holloway had returned, and the world, finally, was listening. Asterisk, Margaret stood quietly in the hallway of Luminatech headquarters, observing the bustling energy around her. It had been weeks since she had assumed leadership of the company, and though the murmurs of disbelief had quieted, the eyes of everyone still followed her with a mix of curiosity and respect. She had become a symbol, a walking contradiction to everything modern corporate culture said about age, gender, and power. But she wasn't seeking applause. What she wanted now was continuity. Real change, not just at the top, but everywhere. Asterisks today marked the beginning of Luminat's internal mentorship initiative, one she had personally designed. The idea was simple. Every executive, herself included, would be paired with a junior employee from a different department, not to teach in the traditional sense, but to exchange ideas, to listen, to see through each other's eyes. The theme was two directions, one vision. Asterisk, Margaret had already met her mentee earlier in the week, a young developer named Jordan, with a background in rural power distribution systems. He was sharp, anxious, and deeply introverted. In their first conversation, he barely made eye contact, but by the end of it, after she asked him about the things that truly mattered to him, his community, his mother's small grocery store back in a small Ohio town, his dreams of making clean energy affordable, he began to open up. Not because she had authority, but because she had listened. Now, she and Jordan stood together in front of a whiteboard in one of the company's innovation rooms. The walls were covered with idea clusters and mind maps from employees across departments. This was not the high-polished glass and metal aesthetic of boardrooms. This was a space alive with thought, where nothing was final, and every idea could grow. Jordan pointed to a sketch he had made. This is a simplified inverter grid system. I've been working on one that works on intermittent power sources, like wind and low-yield solar. The issue is finding a buffer that doesn't spike costs. Margaret studied it carefully, nodding. What if we partner with one of those battery refurbishing startups? We get second life batteries cheap, and you build the system around their specs. Jordan blinked. That might work. I hadn't considered it because I assumed procurement would never approve. Assume nothing, Margaret replied with a smile. Push the door and see if it opens. He looked at her, his face slowly brightening. I was terrified to pitch this before. And now. I still am, he admitted, but now I know it matters. Margaret patted his shoulder. That's how you know it's worth sharing. While the mentorship sessions carried on, Emily was in her office, reviewing case studies. Her posture had changed, once bold and stiff with confidence. Now it was more thoughtful, introspective. She had spent the last few weeks reevaluating her approach to leadership learning, not just from Margaret's rise, but from the wake it had left behind. She had also been watching Margaret not out of suspicion, but curiosity. How had she created so much momentum with so few words? How had she won people over without demanding loyalty? The answer was beginning to dawn on her. Margaret led with presence, not pressure. She didn't talk the loudest. She simply made people feel heard. Later that day, Emily knocked on Margaret's door. She stepped inside, holding a tablet filled with revised proposals. I've been working on something, she said, approaching the desk. Margaret motioned for her to sit. Let's see. Emily opened the file. It's a community-based solar pilot for urban neighborhoods. Local jobs, local training, minimal capital investment. I used Jordan's inverter grid model and built a plan for city council engagement. Margaret scrolled through the document, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up and said softly, "This is good." Emily hesitated, then said, "It's not just a proposal. It's a contribution. I want to be part of what you're building." Margaret met her eyes. There was no triumph in her gaze, only calm acknowledgement. "Then we'll build it together." The conversation was brief, but it meant everything. That night, Margaret returned home later than usual. The air in the house was quiet, dimly lit by soft lamps. She passed by Aaron's study and paused. Inside, he sat on the couch with his laptop, a financial spreadsheet on the screen. "You're still working?" she asked. He looked up and smiled. "Trying to wrap my head around these new energy models. Emily wants me to join her on a city proposal." Margaret stepped in. "She's doing good work." Aaron nodded. "You changed something in her, and in me." Margaret sat beside him. "No, you changed yourselves." I just gave the silence a crack. He turned to her. "I want to ask you something. Why didn't you ever tell me about your consulting years? The companies you built, the awards, the reputation." She took a moment before answering. "Because I thought being a mother was supposed to be quiet, that it meant letting go of who I was. I thought you'd need me to shrink so you could grow." He looked down. "I never wanted that." "I know," she said gently, "but I didn't know how to be both strong and soft back then, so I chose soft. Until someone called me a liability." Aaron winced. "I'm sorry, I let her say those things." "You didn't stop her," Margaret agreed, "but you're listening now. That matters more." He nodded, his eyes slightly glassy. "I'm proud of you." "And I'm proud of you," she replied, touching his hand. "We've all made mistakes, but we're still here." Later, in her room, Margaret pulled out a box from her closet. Inside were artifacts of her forgotten years, her first consulting badge, a newspaper clipping of an award ceremony, a letter from her late husband praising one of her reports. She had saved them not for pride, but for proof that she had once mattered, that she had once been seen. She looked at them now with different eyes. She no longer needed the proof. The world had seen her again. But more importantly, she had seen herself, asterisk, as she packed the items back. She noticed one last thing at the bottom of the boxer's small, aged notebook. She opened it and read her own handwriting from nearly 3 decades ago. Asterisk, one day, I hope I'll get to sit at a table where no one asks for my resume, only my voice. Asterisk, she smiled. That table was now hers. Asterisk, the following morning, she walked into the office early, long before anyone else arrived. She liked the stillness, the way the empty desks seemed to breathe. She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the city that had once seemed too fast, too young, too distracted for someone like her. But she had learned something vital. Asterisk, you don't have to catch up to the world. Sometimes, you simply have to remind it that your pace still matters. Asterisk, she turned from the window, walked to the large glass wall where the company's mission statement was etched, and beneath it, she scribbled on a sticky note and placed it below. Asterisk, wisdom is not the past, it's the pattern. Learn to see it. Asterisk, that day, as employees arrived, the sticky note became a topic of discussion. Nobody saw her place it there, but everyone knew who had written it. It was in her style brief, deep, intentional. Asterisk, Emily passed by it, paused, smiled softly, and walked on. Asterisk, Margaret watched her from her office, heart steady. The company was growing, not just in revenue or innovation, but in humanity. And that, she knew, was the true legacy she would leave behind, not profits or patents, but perspective, not just a comeback story, but a culture shift, not revenge, but renewal. Asterisk, and she had done it without shouting. Asterisk, only by being seen, and refusing ever again to be invisible. Asterisk, the morning sun glowed softly through the windows of Margaret's office, casting warm streaks across the wooden floor and the glass tabletop where a fresh pot of tea sat untouched. The day ahead was quiet, no major meetings, no urgent memos, the gentle rhythm of routine, the kind that came after a storm had passed. She relished it, this stillness, not because it meant the work was done, but because it meant the work had taken root. Now, it was time to nurture what had been planted. Asterisk, she looked out the window toward the city skyline, the view she had once been too intimidated to claim. For decades, that horizon had belonged to others, men in suits, young executives with buzzwords and bravado, leaders who thought loudness was authority, but not anymore. That skyline now also belonged to her, and with it came the weight of stewardship. Asterisk, downstairs, Emily moved through the open concept kitchen with more ease than before. There was no tension in her posture, no air of superiority, just quiet efficiency. She made breakfast for herself and Aaron without a word, but when Margaret entered the room, Emily looked up and met her eyes. Asterisk, tea's hot, she said. I made Jasmine, your favorite. Asterisk, Margaret raised her brows, ever so slightly, pleasantly surprised. Thank you. Asterisk, they sat down at the table. 3 plates, 3 cups. 3 people who had once lived like strangers under one roof, now slowly rediscovering each other. Aaron had his usual easy tone, telling them about an idea to add a vocational training arm to the community energy proposal. Margaret listened, nodding along, encouraging him without stealing the spotlight. Asterisk, after breakfast, Emily lingered. She had a small gift box in her hand, wrapped simply with a ribbon. She handed it to Margaret. Asterisk, I found this in a vintage shop last week, she said. It reminded me of you. Asterisk, inside was a delicate brooch shaped like a compass, its edges engraved with the words True North. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was a symbol, not just of direction, but of clarity, of knowing where you stand, even when others are lost. Asterisk, it's beautiful, Margaret said, touching it gently. Thank you. Asterisk, I didn't understand before, Emily said, her voice softer than usual. How much you gave up, how much you knew. I saw quiet and thought it meant absence, but you were always there, holding everything together. Asterisk, Margaret's smile was tinged with emotion. Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them until the noise clears. Asterisk, Emily nodded. I don't want to lead with noise anymore. I want to lead like you. Asterisk, later that day, Margaret returned to Luminautic to review the final draft of the mentorship report. The impact had exceeded expectations. Productivity had gone up. Employee turnover was down. and new ideas were flowing from levels of the organization that had once been silent. But even more valuable were the stories: the junior engineer who had found his voice, the marketing associate who had designed her first campaign, the retiring technician who decided to stay another year to mentor his replacement. It wasn't about profits. It was about people. The numbers were good, yes, but the culture was better. As she sat with Clara over a late lunch, they reflected on the journey. "Do you regret it?" Clara asked. "Coming back into this world?" Margaret shook her head. "Not for a second. It wasn't easy. No, but I didn't need easy. I needed meaning. You've built something lasting." Margaret smiled. "That's the goal. Not just to win, but to change what winning looks like." That evening, Margaret hosted a small gathering at her home, a celebration, not of her own achievements, but of the team. Employees from every level of Luminatech came: developers, clerks, engineers, managers. Some brought spouses, others brought stories. There were laughter and clinking glasses, lawn games on the back patio, and music humming softly in the background. Emily, standing near the edge of the garden, watched Margaret float through the crowd with ease. No one needed to be impressed. They were simply glad she was there. It was power without ego, authority without intimidation. At one point, Jordan, the mentee from R&D, approached Margaret with a handmade card. Inside was a quote he had copied from her whiteboard. "Wisdom is not the past, it's the pattern." "You changed everything for me," he said. "I used to think people like me didn't matter." "You matter," Margaret said. "Always have. You just needed someone to reflect that back." As the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Margaret stood in her garden beneath the stars, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She felt Aaron step beside her. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "What?" "Being unknown, quiet, private." She thought for a moment. "No, I miss Richard. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of not being responsible for hundreds of people. But I don't miss being invisible. I was never meant to fade." "You never will," he said. "Not anymore." She looked up at the sky. "I used to think my time had passed, that I'd had my shot, and the rest of life was about reflection. But life doesn't hand out expiration dates on relevance. That's something people assign on. It's almost always wrong." Aaron nodded. "You've redefined what success looks like to me, what aging looks like, what legacy looks like." She smiled. "Then I've done what I came to do." As everyone went to bed and the house grew quiet again, Margaret sat by the fireplace with her journal, the same one she had used to document her reawakening. She flipped through the pages, each one marked with growth, pain, strategy, and wisdom. At the very end, she added one last entry. "They called me a liability, but I wasn't a burden. I was a blueprint, silent, steady, and waiting to be rediscovered. I didn't return for vengeance. I returned for value. And I found it, not in proving others wrong, but in remembering I was always right to believe in myself." She closed the journal and looked around her at the photographs, the soft furniture, the lavender-scented candle flickering by the window. Everything had changed, and yet she had never been more herself. In the morning, she would go to work again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to sit at the table she had built, to guide the company she had reclaimed. Two mentor voices just beginning their journeys. And the woman who had once been silenced by circumstance would now be remembered by every soul she had empowered. Margaret Holloway did not just come back. She became the compass, and the world, once deaf to her value, had finally learned to follow.